I'm Johannes Krupp, now a security researcher at CrowdStrike after finishing my PhD at CISPA last year. And today I'm happy to present our work titled AmpFuzz, Fuzzing for Amplification DDoS Vulnerabilities. This has been joint work with my former colleagues at CISPA, Ilya Grishchenko, now at UCSB, and Christian Rossow, still at CISPA. So, in an amplification distributed denial of service attack, we have the attacker on the left who wants to attack the victim on the right. And to do so, he basically picks a number of open servers on the open internet and then abuses two fundamental flaws of core IP services. The first one being that the IP header is non-authenticated, which means that he can send requests to those servers, but spoof them so they appear to be coming from the victim. And the second being that UDP, the protocol abused here, does not have a handshake, meaning that those servers will immediately respond to wherever they think the request came from. Now, to make this even worse, the attacker can be clever about picking these servers and pick ones that reply with much, much larger responses, giving a so-called bandwidth amplification, which is also why we call these systems the amplifiers. And it's important to remember these are basically innocent services. They are just vulnerable to this flaw. A number of protocols actually do have this vulnerability. One common example is NTP, the Network Time Protocol, which for many versions included a debug command called monlist, which allowed you to send an 8-byte request and then receive back a list of all the systems the server had had contact with, given to you in a packet of 440 bytes, but you did not only get a single one of those packets, you got up to 100 of those packets, meaning you had a bandwidth amplification of roughly 5,000. And with flaws like this, it's no wonder that we basically saw headlines after headlines of growing attack bandwidths with going into the terabit regions. For example, end of last year, 2.4 terabits. And the problem behind those is basically we have a large amplification potential in the open internet and also new vulnerabilities which are discovered somewhat regularly. For example, CLDAP in 2017, Memcached in 2018, another VS Discovery protocol in 2019. However, crucially, all these flaws that we've known so far have been found either through manual analysis or were only discovered post-mortem after we've seen attacks. So our research question now basically is, can we find vulnerable protocols systematically and proactively before they're being abused? And since we're in the fuzzing track, the answer to this that we chose is, let's try fuzzing. So the basic idea of fuzzing is you generate randomly some input, you execute a program on it, and then you see whether it crashes. And then you just repeat this over and over again to see whether you can find crashing inputs. The state of the art is so-called coverage-guided mutation-based greybox fuzzing, where instead of generating your input randomly, you start off with a set of seed inputs and then mutate those to generate variants. And instead of executing the program directly, you first instrument the program to provide you with coverage information. And whenever you have a new input that generates new coverage, exercises new parts of the program, you add it to your set of seeds. And again, the goal of classic fuzzing is to find inputs that crash the program. So for finding amplifications, of course, our goal differs. Instead of finding inputs that crash, we want to find requests that excite large responses. And in this talk, basically, I'm talking about how we can adapt this pipeline to our new target. At first, it seems quite simple. Instead of having inputs, we're now talking about UDP requests, and instead of looking for crashes, we're looking for large responses. However, to actually make this work, we also need to add a new instrumentation. Namely, we need to make our target UDP-aware. And what do I mean by UDP awareness? Well, a classic fuzzing target looks somewhat like this. We have some initialization, then we read our input from a file or standard input. We call some functions, maybe some branches crash, and in the end, we just exit. On the other hand, the targets that we're dealing in AmpFuzz are usually servers, which look something like this. So they start off with an initialization, they open a socket, they listen for UDP requests, they maybe send some responses, but crucially, afterwards, they just go back in the loop. So we have two main differences. On the left side, we have inputs from files or standard input. On the right-hand side, we're looking from a socket. And secondly, the classic target is a one-shot program, whereas the target for AmpFuzz are long-running servers. And this is two problems. First one, providing input through a socket is timing sensitive. And secondly, well, our targets do not terminate. So How can we deal with these problems? Talking about the input, the timeline of the startup of a service basically looks like this. If we send a packet during the initialization, well, then we're sending it too early because the UDP socket is not open yet. So the request will be dropped and fuzzing will be ineffective. If we wait a long time, well, then the input is received, but we've wasted a lot of time and our fuzzing becomes ineffective because we have a low throughput. So ideally, we send the packet just about when the socket is opened and the service is ready. And this is something, fortunately, that we can enforce with our instrumentation. Namely, we can make the target notify the fuzzer that it's ready, just by inserting another function that notifies our fuzzer that we're now ready to receive input, and then continue the execution. And this solves the first problem. We still have the second problem, though, is that the processing does not terminate. And this is a problem for us, because as a fuzzer, we don't know whether we will never receive a request or receive run requests or many. However, we can actually try to transform this into a one-shot program. How do we do this? Well, the heuristic that we came up with is the following. Initially, we identify all functions that act as a source, meaning those can be blocking, waiting for input. In this example, it's the call to receive. Secondly, we identify all functions that act as sinks, that send out responses to us. In this case, the call to send. And lastly, we're looking for edges that come from a source and cannot reach a sink without passing through another source first. In this instance, these are these two branches, because once we've walked past the send function, we cannot return without going over the receive. And, well, if we've traversed one of those branches, we just redirect it and call exit instead. And now the program terminates whenever we have passed the point of sending a response. And this also solves the second problem. I should add that this is only a heuristic and does not work in cases where we have some weird multi-threading situations. In our experiments, this only happened for 2 cases, though. At this point, you might ask, why you're not just using fixed timeouts? Because if you just wait for a fixed amount of time, eventually the service will be ready. So here are 2 examples. Basically, we're plotting the time it took us, our fuzzer, to find the first input that generated any response in seconds. And with a fixed static timeout of 100 milliseconds on the first target, VOS server, it took roughly 10 seconds. And on the second example, it took something over 70 seconds. Now, if we split this static timeout in half, well, also our fuzzing increases. So in the first instance, we're now down to something over 5 seconds, and in the second instance, something over 40. Reducing the timeout even further, though, we see something interesting happening. With a static timeout of 10 milliseconds, we see that the second target still decreases the fuzzing time. However, in the first instance, we're now way up to 70 seconds. And this actually happens because most of the packets in this instance are now dropped, because they either sent too early or we terminate the program before it was able to send us a response. And this also highlights why our UDP-aware instrumentation is so important. Because with UDP-aware instrumentation, we don't need to have a target-specific timeout, and we're faster in both instances. So UDP-aware fuzzing eliminates the need for target-specific timeouts. And this is important why we need UDP awareness. So far, we basically have a pipeline that is able to find responses. We haven't talked so much about how we can find large responses. And for this, we actually added another mutation operator, specifically for amplification. To demonstrate this, this is an example, an amplification that we found in the RX debug protocol, which allows you to request some debug statistics about communication. The protocol basically uses a 28-byte header and an 8-byte payload, and allows you, with a 36-byte request, to get a response of roughly 312 bytes, or an amplification of 8.67. However, if we look at the bytes at the raw level, we find that only very few fields are actually relevant to what is happening. In this specific instance, it's only those 6 bytes, saying that we have a debug packet, that the client is ready to receive data, and lastly, that we're looking for statistics. Combined with the fact that actually there are often no length checks for the received input, this means we can actually drop these last 4 bytes. meaning we can improve our amplification by sending a non-protocol compliant request of only 32 bytes, but still receive the same 312-byte response, thereby increasing our factor to 9.75. And with this, we have our full pipeline. The only thing that we need to add is we also need to take now instances into account and add them to our seed if they find any response, because any response that we can find, we could potentially improve to have a better one. We did evaluate AmpFuzz on 28 UDP open source network services from the Debian repositories, ran them for 24 hours, and repeated all experiments 5 times. And among those 28 targets, we actually found amplification vulnerabilities in 9 services, with amplification factors ranging from 1.09 to 32. Not only that, we actually discovered that many of those targets have multiple amplification vectors that can be abused. TalkD, for example, only has a single one, but in the case of BS server, we can actually find 200 different requests that trigger amplification behavior. And lastly, to point this out, 5 of these have been previously unknown. So, yes, all vulnerabilities also have been disclosed to the corresponding respective project maintainers. But to summarize, I've shown how to adapt our pipeline to find amplification vulnerabilities with fuzzing. I have talked about how UDP awareness is helpful in finding the challenges of UDP network fuzzing, how we can improve amplification factors, and lastly, shown evaluation results. Our artifacts are available on GitHub. I've been Johannes Krupp. Thank you for your time. Now happy to take questions.